Welcome back to our study of Matthew. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about righteousness. And what we learned in verse 20 is that the scribes and Pharisees had established their own rules of righteousness, their own definition of what a righteous person was going to be like. And then Jesus comes and says, you're going to have to do a whole lot better than those guys. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, then you're not going to make it to the kingdom of heaven. And as we mentioned before, that had to have been shocking to hear that, because they saw the scribes and Pharisees as the epitome of what righteousness was supposed to be like. But the fact of the matter is, they had, like Paul describes in Romans chapter 10, established their own definition of righteousness. Don't we do that today? Don't we say, well, he is such a good person. I can't believe that God wouldn't save him. Or she is one of the nicest people I've ever met. She's very kind. She's a moral person, as honest as the day is long. And so we think, well, those are really good people. Surely they're going to be saved. We're doing the same thing. We're guilty of the same thing the Pharisees were doing, and that is establishing our own standard of righteousness. Isaiah said in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, speaking the words of God, God says that my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. God doesn't think like we think. He doesn't operate like we would operate. And so what we need to do is we just need to slow down, take time out, and go back to looking at the Bible, because it is the Bible that reveals the mind and heart of God. And we're not going to understand the way God feels or the way God looks at something outside of revelation. We're just not going to be able to figure out what God is like. We have to go to the Word in order to find out what God is like. And so the scribes and Pharisees were able to take some passages and then reason from those passages what God was like. In our previous class, we talked about, for example, when they would say, "Thou shalt not kill." And then Jesus comes and says, "But I say to you that don't be angry." Well, the scribes and Pharisees did not believe that being angry was a sin, and that you could harbor anger in your heart and even say words that were angry words. But Jesus talked about 3 levels of increasing anger, and that those that had that kind of anger, they were not going to be saved. As a matter of fact, Jesus makes reference of one that is verbalizing, is spewing out hatred and anger, is going to go to the fires of hell. And now we move to the second of 6. Remember, there are 6 contrasts that we have here. Each one begins with Jesus saying, "You have heard that it was said," followed by, "But I say to you." All right, as you look in your Bible, you can see the next one is in verse 27. "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery." Well, as we mentioned before, you have heard that it was said. These people did not see the scriptures with their own eyes. What they knew about scriptures was what they were being told by these scribes and Pharisees. And Jesus is referring to the law of Moses, Exodus 20 and verse 14, that said those very words, "You shall not commit adultery." Excuse me. He says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery with her already in his heart." So the Pharisees, based upon their understanding of the 10 Commandments and the one that said that thou shalt not commit adultery, is that you could look but you could not touch. And so as far as lust was concerned, they had no rules or regulations against that. They did not consider that to be something that was an affront to God. Jesus is calling one to a higher level of spirituality. Remember, we're talking here about righteousness, about what a righteous person is really going to be like. And here, Jesus is identifying the problem is you're looking to lust. In other words, that is why the person is looking. Then it is sin. And I make that distinction because I believe it's important for us to understand that there is something that is natural in the way that God created men, is that we are visually stimulated. And so if we see something that is of a sexual nature, we're not looking for that, but you just happen to see an image, or you see someone in a public place that's a woman that is dressed immodestly. There are going to be immediate feelings of sexuality. That's just part of our wiring. That's part of the makeup. But what does a person do? What, in that example, does a man do from that point on? He's had that initial sexual reaction, but does he continue to look? Then it's moved into a category of sin. Then it moves into the category that Jesus is talking about here. Because now you are looking to lust. That's why you're continuing to look. But if you had that initial reaction, you look away, you get your mind on other things, then no sin has been committed. Jesus is saying that one who looks to lust has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And so it's very important that we understand that to be truly righteous, that not only can you not commit adultery, but you also need to control your mind and your heart. You're not looking to lust. One of the problems of interpretation that we have had with this verse is that some have considered this to be grounds for divorce, because Jesus says that he has committed adultery. And if you've committed adultery, then the innocent party in this case is then free to divorce that person and marry another. But I would like to appeal to you to recognize that this is not an apples with apples kind of comparison here. This is not grounds for divorce. Well, why not? First of all, Jesus qualifies what he is saying by describing this is in the heart. It is a heart problem, as opposed to the sin of adultery is actually something that involves two people, that involves the physical interaction between those two people. So the fact that Jesus put that in the heart phrase shows that he is qualifying what he is talking about, that is separating it from the sin of the actual sin of adultery. We would also point out, using terminology that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 16, that they have not become one flesh. When you look at someone and you lust, that is a sin. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that it's not a sin. Just trying to say, does it rise to the level of consequence where one can divorce another for the sin of adultery and then marry someone else? He has not made himself one flesh with her, because there haven't been two people that have actually committed the sin of adultery with the actual touching and engaging in sexual promiscuity. Using similar terminology from Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19, where Paul lists sins of the flesh. This is not a sin of the flesh because it is, as tying it back in with what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 6, it doesn't fall into that same category. So the answer is this grounds for divorce? The answer is no, that it is not. It is a sin. Jesus is saying that the righteous people are not going to be guilty of this particular sin. But would also like to offer a couple of points on the basis of logic. In 1 John 3 and verse 15, John says that the one who hates his brother is a murderer. Well, if one hates, do we need to lock him up? Do we need to put him in jail because he is now guilty of murder? Well, I don't think that any logically thinking person would argue that. And I also wonder how many of us who would admit to having hatred in our heart sometime in our life towards someone else now considers ourselves, as far as the consequences are concerned, being someone that committed murder. Do we see those as the same? Now, again, just by way of clarification, when we're standing before God on the day of judgment, is there going to be a difference between someone that actually committed murder and someone that harbored and expressed hatred toward a brother? That's probably not going to make a distinction on the day of judgment, because either one of those are sins and can condemn a person's soul. But as we recognize that there are consequences that are a little bit different for things in this life, and that's what we're talking about. While granted, in the eyes of God, hatred is equivalent to murder, it doesn't have the same in this life consequence. So also is it then, and this is the logic point that we're trying to make, with lust. Lust is a sin, but it is not one in this life that rises to the same consequence as the actual sin of adultery. And then another point of logic would be this: who hasn't lusted? I suspect that all of us, if we were honest, would know that at one point of time in our life, maybe several times in our life, we have been guilty of lust, men and women alike. The number one growing internet website is pornography for women. And so women are not immune to the sin of lust. We've always kind of categorized that as a man problem. But in our world today, it is not a man problem. It is a growing problem among women and is the fastest growing area according to recent internet surveys. And so we have a problem in our world of lust, and we are making images that are going to encourage one to lust more and more readily available on our computers, our electronic devices like our smartphones, obviously on television, advertising, publications, and so on. We are dealing in a world that has a real sin problem, especially in the area of lust. And so my point of logic here is, who has not been guilty of this sin? And so if a woman is wanting to divorce her husband because he was guilty of lust, can she claim that she's never been guilty of that sin herself? And I suspect she would not be able to claim that. And so again, there are differences to the consequence to a particular sin as being mentioned here. So this is not grounds for one divorcing and marrying someone else. But it is certainly one that we all need to back up and think a little bit about. Are we righteous people? The kind of righteous people that God wants us to be. think about it from this perspective too. If I am able to control my anger, do you think there's ever going to be a possibility that I'm going to commit murder? That my anger gets so out of control that I'm actually so out of control that I'm going to take someone else's life? Well, if I control my anger, then I'm not ever going to get to that point. So also with lust, do you think a person that is able to control his or her lust is ever going to get to the point where they are so moved with passion that they're going to commit adultery? Well, no, not if they control their lust. So Jesus is teaching us that true righteousness begins in the heart. We control our feelings, our emotions with anger. We control our desires and our lust from within, and then we're not ever going to get to the point of where we kill someone or we are guilty of adultery. That's the way true righteous people are going to act. Then in verse 29, Jesus says, "And if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you." When we think about the context of what Jesus is saying here, this has been a much misunderstood and unfortunately misapplied teaching of Jesus. I have in my files several articles, and unfortunately several people have actually applied this particular text literally. As a matter of fact, I have one story about a college-age young man that when his roommate came home, he found him having already chopped off his right hand and was in the process of plucking out his right eye. And the roommate walked in on that, obviously a very bloody scene, and he was asking him for help to finish the job of getting the right eye out. Can you imagine? But as the police got there and as the paramedics got there, they found the Bible open to Matthew chapter 5. So he had been reading this text and had determined that he was going to apply it literally. Let's talk, though, about what Jesus is really saying. The right eye and the right hand were considered to be the most precious body parts. And so Jesus is using the parts of our body that we would be most protective of, that we would consider to be the most important parts of our body. And the point that Jesus is making is that it is better to lose the dearest thing in life than to lose one's soul. Now, if you're following what I'm saying, then this is a teaching about priorities. That Jesus is wanting us to recognize that there is nothing, or should be nothing, more important than protecting our soul. And that anything that gets in the way of damaging our soul or puts us in a position of losing our soul, then that is something that we need to address because it is very serious. So he was just talking about looking at a woman to lust. Well, here we have an eye problem. And so Jesus is saying you'd be better to be without those body parts than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. So he's emphasizing the earnestness that one should have in pursuing righteousness. How serious are you about your soul? How focused are you? Determined are you to protect the most precious thing that you have? Because Jesus is going to teach in Matthew 16 that you don't have anything that's more valuable than your soul. And unfortunately, there are people that will give up their soul for even the smallest of things. How serious are we in making sure that the part of us that's going to live on to eternity is one that is protected, and one that is, in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, righteous. That's what Jesus is talking about. You need to be serious, and by way of illustration, not to be applied literally, but by way of illustration, saying you'd be better to lose your right eye than to lose your soul, your right hand than to lose your soul. And so the question is asked, is this meant to be applied literally? Is Jesus somehow teaching that if we do have a problem with lust, we need to think about plucking our eyes out? If we have a problem with stealing or doing something with our hands that's sinful, that we need to think seriously about cutting off those hands? Well, the answer is no. And here are the reasons why this is a no answer. First of all, it would turn the church into a hospital, that everyone in the church would recognize that they have struggled with lust, they have struggled with maybe doing things, going places that they shouldn't. So you've got people cutting feet off, cutting hands off. It would turn the church into a hospital. And where do we read about that? Anywhere. Anywhere in the Bible, anywhere in the New Testament, anywhere in early church history. Well, you don't, but you know that we would have had many passages making reference to this brother or this sister who, out of loyalty to Jesus, had maimed themselves. Well, it didn't happen, is my point. Well, why didn't it happen? If Jesus is intending this to be applied literally, you can be assured it would have happened. But it didn't, because the early Christians knew that what Jesus was teaching was a principle not to be applied literally. Also, think about this. It would not stop the person from sinning, because the sin is in the heart. And so if a person has the problem of lusting, well, plucking out the eyes is not going to end that problem, because those images that are the lustful images are still implanted in the brain and in the heart. And so even though a person may have blinded himself, that doesn't keep him from still having saved those images in his mind and heart. And so my point is, just because a person no longer has eyes does not mean that they cannot be guilty of lust. Well, if a person has problem with stealing, and so he cuts off his right hand, well, now he can steal with his left hand. So he cuts off his left hand, and now he learns to steal with his mouth or with his feet. You get my point, that you can continue to sin even if you literally applied what Jesus is saying. And so that shows us that he's not meaning for it to be applied literally. And then one other point, and that is self-abasement, injuring the body, is something that is against God's will. It was condemned in Mosaic law, and it's also that which Paul, in passages like Colossians 2 and verse 23, says that this is not what God wants. He does not want us in a way of showing our loyalty or our faithfulness to God to actually damage our body, hurt our body in some way. So Jesus is saying, be serious, very serious. How serious, Jesus? Serious enough that you would be willing to lose an eye, lose a hand. Not that you would literally do that, but you'd be serious enough where now you understand the gravity of what Jesus is saying. So we need to be people that are so very determined to rid our lives of sin and to be very focused on being righteous people in the eyes of God. Because as Jesus says, that you are going to be facing God in the day of judgment, And if you have not controlled your body, then he says you're going to be thrown into hell. He says both in verses 29 and 30. Very amazing passage, very important passage that Jesus here is teaching about righteousness. All right, so look at what we've looked at so far. Jesus has, you have heard that it was said, you shall not kill. He talks to them about anger. He said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Then he talks to them about lust. And now in verse 31, he moves into a third category, and that is divorce. And it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of dismissal. All right, Jesus is drawing from a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Now, what the Pharisees had taught was this idea of giving a particular document to the wife. The Old Testament was a very male perspective law, and so the idea of a wife divorcing her husband was not something that was a part of Mosaic law. But so he's talking about it from a man that he gives his wife this legal certificate, and the Hebrew word for that legal certificate was called a get. It's funny that we've got an English word that is the same, but G-E-T is what this was called. As a matter of fact, in the discussions of various religious topics in the book that's called the Mishnah, they actually have an entire tractate that's called the Gettim. Well, the Gettim is talking about divorce and this idea of giving this certificate. This piece of paper had these words, "Lo, thou art free to marry any man," from Gettim, chapter 9 and verse 3, which is in the Mishnah. All right, so the man would give the get to his wife, and when he would do that, that would, from that point on, completely free her. Now, that's what was being taught from Deuteronomy chapter 24. But the problem was that they made divorce something very easy. And all a man had to do was just make sure that he put that piece of paper in her hand. And off she could go and she could marry someone else. And you may have heard about 3 prominent rabbis, 2 of which lived during the time of Jesus or right before, Aqaba and Shammai, Hillel and Shammai, that all had different views of how to interpret Deuteronomy 24. And then another rabbi, Aqaba, that came along a little bit later, that had a third take on Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1. But the idea was that you could divorce if you found someone that you thought was prettier. You could divorce her if you found someone that was more desirable, or as Hillel would say, if she burned a dish, if that happened, then you could find someone else. It seems like Shammai was the one that had the view that aligned with what Jesus taught, and that is only if she was sexually unfaithful could you divorce and give her the get. So the Pharisees had the concept that you could divorce all you want, just make sure you give her the certificate. Now, this has led some people to argue that that was really the problem, is you had men that were divorcing, but they were not given the get, the certificate, with the hope or with the evil intent that she's still tied to him and he could bring her back if he wanted to, because she never really got her release papers. But there's Nothing in history, nothing in the Old Testament, nothing in biblical history that would indicate that this was really a problem. What the problem was the freedom with which they felt like they could divorce. The truly righteous are going to go back to the creation account. One man, one woman for life. That was the position that God had established in the garden, the position of which Jesus is going to discuss when we look at Matthew chapter 19. So, divorce all you want was what their level of righteousness was. Just make sure you give her a certificate. Jesus, though, is saying, no, do not do this. Do not be so quick and so flippant with divorce. You need to think about what it does to her. First of all, it forces her into what we might refer to as survival mode, where she will most likely try to remarry. Opportunities for women in ancient times were very different than women today who could easily go out, find a job, and support themselves. Well, women in biblical times were geared to, from even being a young girl, were taught all the skills of domestic, being homemakers. And the idea of they're going out and getting a job, well, there were just not jobs available. And so a man divorces his wife. What is she going to do? Well, her number one option was to go and get married again. And so Jesus is saying if she did remarry, then she would be guilty of adultery. Again, look at the text in verse 32. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So Jesus says quite clearly that if he does this, he divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And then he adds one additional point regarding the one who would marry her would also be guilty of adultery. Now, why is that? The reason is because she is not eligible to marry someone else. It shows that the bond is not broken by divorce, as some people have tried to argue today. He has divorced her, has sent her away. Well, she's not eligible for marriage again. And if she does get married again, then she's guilty of adultery. And the condition of the person that would marry her, now he is guilty of adultery as well. Now, Jesus does add an exception clause, just like in Matthew 19 and verse 9. It says, verse 32, except for the cause of unchastity. This is the word porneia in Greek. Sexual immorality is what this particular word means. We already know that it would be acceptable for a righteous man to put away his wife for immorality. What Joseph was thinking of doing with Mary, because he thought she was guilty of immorality, was something that was perfectly acceptable and actually was what was allowed in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1. Shammai had it right that if, in fact, a woman is guilty of sexual unfaithfulness, then he could put her away for immorality. So what Jesus is saying here in verse 32 does parallel what is being said in Matthew 19 and verse 9. In this case, he would not be making her commit adultery because she already has committed adultery. Now, follow this very carefully, because this is a verse that is greatly misunderstood and misapplied. First of all, let's look at verse 32 if we take out the exception clause. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. All right, he divorces her, and it is not because of immorality. He just divorces her. He makes her commit adultery because now he's put her away, say, for incompatibility. Well, she's in survival mode. She marries again. It is not a God-approved marriage because God has her joined to him, her first husband. And now she is an adulteress. But when we put the exception clause in, that reverses the next thing that's said. If he puts her away for the cause of unchastity, it says makes her commit adultery. Well, he doesn't make her commit adultery because she already is guilty of adultery. That's why he's putting her away. Notice he says except for the cause of porneia, except for the cause of sexual unfaithfulness. So putting away an unfaithful wife does not make her commit adultery. She's already guilty of adultery. That's why he's putting her away. So hopefully that clarifies what is being said, because there are two possible scenarios that Jesus is describing. So the man who foolishly and unscripturally divorces his wife, the wife who has not committed fornication, he gets the ball rolling on two other sins. First of all, adultery when the wife remarries, because he knows in those ancient times she's going to get remarried. That survival mode that we were talking about. Well, it's really the first husband's fault for putting away this wife. Does not have a legitimate reason to put her away. Finding someone prettier, that's not a good reason. Because she burned a meal, not a good reason. But those what some of the other rabbis were saying. But instead, he puts her away for a reason other than sexual immorality. Problem number one is he puts her in a situation where she is most likely going to marry again, and that would be an adulterous marriage. And then the second problem that the first husband has created is now the man that she marries is also guilty of adultery according to Jesus. So when we look at the way Jesus describes what is going on here, it is the truly righteous are not going to be thinking about divorce. They have said, until death do we part. They have recognized that it is a covenant that they've made with one another and with God, and that they are going to endure the rough times, the hard times, the difficult times. They're committed to each other. They're committed to being faithful to one another. And as Jesus is going to make very clear in Matthew 19 and verse 9, the only scriptural reason to break up a marriage is with sexual unfaithfulness. And that's was very shocking teaching both to the disciples, and one that the Pharisees pushed back on when we read there in Matthew chapter 19. Righteousness in the eyes of God is one that recognizes the sanctity of marriage, recognizes the beauty of marriage and the marriage relationship. And so they are not going to be thinking about getting divorced. That we are entering into this marriage covenant with the idea of till death do us part. So understand what Jesus is teaching here, because verse 32 is a verse that has certainly been twisted and distorted in a number of different ways to justify just about anybody divorcing, and everybody has the right to remarry. And the question that I continue to ask is, what about that last phrase, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery? And it's nothing about that that's confusing. What exactly does that mean? And what it means is that the man divorced her not for a scriptural reason, and now she marries again. She's an adulteress. The man who marries her is also guilty of adultery. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up in our next class with the next of the contrast that Jesus has given here in Matthew chapter 5.